Well, welcome to the Ahern video podcast. This is part 3 of the due diligence process. Over the last 2 weeks, we've discussed beginning the process of the due diligence. We've talked about making sure that the buyer's qualified. We've talked about discussing range of values to make sure that you're in agreement. We've talked about working with your advisors to tell them what exactly they need to do. Working with your advisors to specifically make sure they don't run up the meter. Setting time frames for your advisors, which are your accountant and your attorney, and then not letting somebody else negotiate. We also discussed the fact if there's issues, don't keep redlining contracts back and forth, but simply pick up the phone, discuss them between both parties, and then make a decision. This week I want to discuss on the fact that there is no utopia in a contract. There's going to be give and take on both sides, and there is always going to be a risk. People tell me all the time that I want a stock purchase because the fact that I save taxes and then all my liabilities go away, and that's an absolute fabrication. You may have some tax advantages, but your liabilities do not go away. In a stock sale, there's normally a basket deductible, and in that basket deductible, they say if claims are over that, it comes back to you anyway. So what I want you to do is focus on phase 3 or part 3, and is how do you move the process along. It's going to be very important that if you've got trucks and trailers that you understand what the schedules are. You have to have a time frame. And schedules are basically exhibits that have to be attached to the purchase agreement in order for you to close and for the buyer's bank to fund if they're funding any of the equipment. So for example, let's say that the fair market value of the equipment that's agreed to is $9 million. You've got $5 million worth of debt. That $4 million of equity flows to you. Well, in order for that $4 million of equity to flow to you, you have to make sure that you have all the titles, you have release on the titles, you have the payoffs on the titles as of a certain date, and that's normally the closing date, because what will happen is this. Most buyers will send out wires or certified checks, etc., at closing to the various lenders to get the releases. Now that's critical, because if you don't do that, the closing's not going to take place. In many instances, you may have personal vehicles or RV or things like that. Normally, it's not part of the business. They're going to let you take it, or they may take it out of the deduction from the total value, but they don't want a motorhome. They don't want a boat. They just don't want it. It's not part of the operations. If you've got a life insurance policy, that's yours also to keep, but they're not going to continue to perpetuate it. And then, when you get all this information together, when all the statistical information is together, when you've looked at the purchase agreement and you think everything's fine, just when you think you're going to cross the finish line, something else happens. 9 out of 10 times when you're getting really close, they'll ask for an update on your financials. And if they see any trend that's going downward, or any trend with any business fluctuations, that could cause them to say, hey, we want to back off for a while, or hey, we don't feel comfortable here, or hey, we might want to change some of the payout structure. But be prepared for that. At all times, you have to realize that a buyer and a seller have to agree, but at the same time, it's an emotional process. If a buyer asks you something, it doesn't necessarily mean that that buyer, he or she, is trying to take advantage of you. It means that when they've gone through the due diligence process, there's been some red flags that have been raised, and it concerns them. Emotionally, don't overreact. If you start overreacting and you get too emotional and you start saying things that you don't mean, the deal's dead. You have to be very, very careful. Also, in your negotiation process, I'm going to tell you right up front, you can never negotiate and say, oh, by the way, you have to take care of Mary, Sue, Joe, and Billy because they've been with me for years. That's your obligation. And any portion of the purchase price that you want to carve out for those individuals, you can. But it's not the buyer's responsibility. Next week, I'm going to talk about crossing the finish line. The last final things that you have to do to make sure that you're properly prepared. The things that can throw a wrench into the deal at the last minute. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, you can never take your focus off your business, but at the same time, you need to keep driving the deal forward. Until next time, thank you for attending the podcast.